Hello, hi everyone. I'm Professor Dimitra Fimi. I'm a Professor of Fantasy and Children's Literature, and I'm one of the two co-convenors of the Fantasy MLitt program. And shall we do a round of introductions, Will?
Yes, so I'm Will Tattersdill, and I'm a Senior Lecturer in Contemporary Fantasy Cultures, and I'm the other co-convenor of the MLitt in Fantasy. Hollie.
Hello, I'm Hollie Willis. I'm a second-year PhD student here at the University of Glasgow, and I took the MLitt in Fantasy Literature back in 2020.
Great. So we're here to answer any questions you might have. I presume most of you will have watched the presentation that myself and Will recorded, and hopefully you will have had a sense of, what the program looks like, what kind of core courses there are, a sense of our options, the way that things are taught, but also a bit about Glasgow and about the university as well, and also the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic with all of the extra opportunities and things to do, extracurricular, etc. So we're here to, as I said at the beginning, to answer any questions, and feel free to post those as we go. So let me see if we have one already. Not quite there yet, but you will see that the link to the program has already been posted there, again, just in case. Great. I guess I'm just trying to think what are the sort of typical questions that are coming up while we're waiting for you to sort of have a think. We're often asked about the sort of the induction and how the first sort of arrival and the first sort of week before the actual courses, the actual teaching starts, is handled. So you will usually have an induction at program level, you would have an induction at school level, and you'd have an induction at college level. So usually you will get a sense of the whole structure of the university more widely, but also very, very bespoke and specific things about the program, including like rooms and timetables and where everything is. It is a very, very labyrinthine campus. It's beautiful and sort of neo-Gothic, but you can get lost quite easily in it. So a lot of it is sort of finding your bearings and all that. Okay. Yeah, and we were saying with Hollie just before we started that, Hollie, you were the generation that did a lot of it online, because that was one of the lockdowns when you were doing the program, right? So no issues about buildings, but of course you were in Glasgow before, so you will have had the experience of losing yourself, getting lost on campus, which is, yeah.
No, absolutely. It's a lot of different buildings to navigate.
Sure. Okay, so Hollie, shall we start just with a general question to you, which is, why did you choose to do this master's? And then I'll again, I can see questions coming up, which is great, but maybe give us a bit of your perspective.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I actually first learned about the Fantasy MLitt back when I was actually applying for my undergrad degree. I kind of skipped ahead and thought, oh, that looks good. And I've been reading fantasy literature literally ever since I was little. And just the idea of like you're studying fantasy literature at such a high level, I'd never heard of that before, and it intrigued me. So, got the undergrad degree first, then went on to the fantasy literature MLitt, and it was an absolutely brilliant time. And it led me to my PhD, which I'm currently in the middle of. But yeah, it just really caught my eye with, that combination of like a critical analysis of fantasy with just that love of reading fantasy for fun as well.
Great. Okay, so I'm seeing questions here. Actually, there's two questions about dissertation, so it might be worth answering those together, I suppose. So one question is about how students are paired with a supervisor, and then more detail about the dissertation process. So in the UK system, a master's long project at the end is called a dissertation, while the PhD is called a thesis, which I know is slightly different in other places of the world. So this is the terminology, right? The dissertation is your long research project at the end of the process. So what happens is that you don't start working on the dissertation until you have finished with your taught programs. And actually, we are at the moment at the point of the year when we're starting this process in terms of people submitting their abstracts for their dissertations and allocating supervisors, etc. So you will be doing your semester 1 courses September to December, then you'll be doing your spring semester courses January to March usually. And then around that time in March, you will be asked to submit a dissertation abstract. So sort of brief idea of what you want to do your dissertation on. And that is what we'll use to then pair you with a dissertation supervisor. It's a big team. It's also a big department. So there's lots of expertise, and a lot of it will have to do with who fits quite well with the area of study that you want to focus on. And then you will be presenting on your dissertation idea as part of the research training course. So that's the first time where you will air out in front of an audience, and you'll be assessed on your dissertation idea. And then after that, you will have your 3 to 4 meetings with the supervisor throughout from April, May, all the way to usually late August or very early September when you submit your dissertation. So it's a good few months when you'll be working on that with feedback from your supervisor. Your supervisor will be also reading a sample of your written work and providing feedback, but a lot of it at the beginning is sort of narrowing down the idea often, or sort of making it more focused, making sure that it can actually be done within the word count that you have, which is 15,000 words tops. It sounds like a very long piece of work, and it will be compared to the rest of the assessments you will be doing, but it also needs to be feasible within those parameters. So that's how that works. I hope that answered the question about the process and the pairing with advisors. So that happens at the central level, and it's matching expertise with your chosen topic. If there's further questions on the dissertation, please put them in, and we'll have another look. Okay. So there's a question about support for international students, and this is where I suppose I should have said probably at the beginning that you have 2 academics here and a student, a current PhD student and former master's student. So we're very good at answering questions about the academic content of the course and the general experience. But not so much on the very specific things for specific categories, things like fees or accommodation or whatever. But the team that's here supporting us at the moment will be able to point you to the right direction in terms of links. So I think a link has already been added to the chat with more detail about international students and specific support for international students outside the program. What I should say probably is that the program is very international. We do get people from all over the world every year. So if you're joining us from outside the UK, you won't be the only one by any stretch of the imagination. It is a very, very, cosmopolitan course, I would call it.
No, in fact, I think this year, Dimitra, there's only perhaps 3-4 British students on the Fantasy MLitt. So it's very gloriously international, and that's something that I think is one of the real strengths of the course.
Sure. Okay, so there's a question about the an application question, and coming from a non-literature background. Okay, yes, that's a very good question actually, because I know there's a mixture here. Some of you will have had your offers already. Some of you are still sort of are still possibly applying. We definitely had. We every year have students who came from a different background rather than strictly speaking English literature. As long as the area that you studied before is cognate, and there is sort of shared theoretical or critical sort of apparatus that you can use actually, and that can support your studies, that's absolutely fine. So we've had people in the past who've done any other humanities subject like history. We've had people who have done drama before. We've had people who've done philosophy before. I'm just trying to think, but also social sciences. We have people who have done education degrees, for example, that then came on to children's literature, for example, sometimes sits in that weird position between English literature and education. So any of those should be fine. If in doubt, always contact us directly and give us the specifics of your situation if you're unsure. But we've been quite open, and lots of people have come from non-strictly English literature degrees. Anything to add on that?
I just add to that, Dimitra, that that I think it might be important to stress that this is not a creative writing degree. We do see a few applications that make that mistake, and of course, a lot of our students are interested in becoming fantasy authors, and that's great. And we think and hope that this program can be useful to someone with those aspirations. But it is an English literature program, and although you can take creative writing courses as
options,
optionally, you do not get a creative writing degree, and that's not what we teach. Although, again, hopefully it will be helpful to you if that is the path you consider yourself to be on. I'm mentioning that just because we've seen a few applications this year, haven't we, Dimitra, that sort of seem to misunderstand that a little bit. So that might be worth clarifying.
Yeah. So
but
when
if you have a creative writing background and you're coming to this, then that's fine, I think, as long as you know what it is that we're doing.
And I suppose you make sure that the sample that you're sending in with the application is a critical work sample rather than a creative sample. Okay, I think there's a question here for Hollie about, so Hollie, you've already started answering this one because I asked at the beginning, but the question is, why did you choose to stay at Glasgow for your PhD, and how did the master's lead into what you're doing now?
In terms of staying in Glasgow, well, for one, I really love the city, wanted to stay, but predominantly for staying at Glasgow Uni for my PhD in particular was the community of fantasy scholars that I was able to join, just that sheer depth and breadth of expertise. And I was able to get paired up with a couple of supervisors who, they live and breathe exactly what I'm doing for my PhD, which, leading on, is, in a short version, is funerals and fantasy literature. So a cheery topic. But yeah, it just ended up being like the perfect place to continue doing what I love. And yes, the MLitt was really like the sort of the bridge to the PhD, because it introduced like the critical analysis of fantasy literature, the fact that you could even do that, and then bridging my other interests in the dark and the morbid, and also sort of like the multimedia aspect of it, because I'm not just looking at texts, I'm looking at TV show adaptations, films, comics, graphic novels, which, before the MLitt I wouldn't have even considered. So it's really opened up the possibilities, and I'm having a lot of fun as a result.
Great, excellent. It's worth also saying that if people are, often people come to the Fantasy Masters with a plan already to do a PhD afterwards. Whether staying at Glasgow or not is another story, but we do a bit of talking in preparation about how to start thinking about a PhD application during your Fantasy MLitt time here with us, including things like funding for PhDs, etc. So there is, that's something we're thinking ahead of, because it's not unusual for people to come with an idea to continue. Not everyone does, obviously, and lots of people go into employment afterwards, and it's lovely to see what everybody's doing. And yeah, we try to keep in touch. Okay, there's a question about two people asking about part-time study, and that's a really good one that again comes up every year as a question. So if you remember the presentation that I did, that mostly presented the template of how the program is studied full time. So remember that in semester one you would have two obligatory courses, two core courses, which is Fantasy 1 and your research training course, and then one option. And then the semester you have your second core course, Fantasy 2, and two options. And then in the summer you've got the dissertation. So for part-time, you would be doing your core course and your research training course in semester one, but you will not be taking the option. And then in semester 2, you'll be doing Fantasy 1 and one option, but you will not be then engaging with the dissertation at all in that year. Then in your second year, all that's left then to do is to have your one option in semester one, your one option in semester 2, and the dissertation all through the year. So that is the way that this is broken down. We definitely have a couple of students every year who take that route, and that's the way that the workload is balancing out, so that we make sure that throughout the year, the 2 years are more or less equal in terms of the work that you'll be doing. So I hope that was clear. Do ask any further questions about that. But yes, that's it. It's literally it's cutting down the workload in a manageable way within the 2 years rather than in one. Okay, let me just look through.
So we've got a question, Dimitra, about placement on American PhD programs. That's an interesting one, isn't it? I know of a couple of students who have ended up in that place, but I don't know if we keep statistics on that sort of thing. Perhaps more generally, it would be worth talking about what our graduates get up to and kind of
Yeah,
what they
that's
do.
a good point. I mean, I'm not sure what is meant by placement there. I presume it just meant how many people have gone on to do PhDs in the States. Is that the question? If not, do post the clarification, please. But yeah, as I said, we have students who stay with us and continue a PhD. We definitely have people who continue a PhD elsewhere, including in the States. So I'm just off the top of my head remembering at least 2 or 3 people the last 5-6 years of the program that have ended up in American universities doing PhDs. There's lots of people who have gone into publishing, into sort of editorial work, including in journals and journalism. People have ended up doing work in heritage studies like museums and galleries, etc. Teaching, including sort of secondary school teaching and primary school teaching. So go on to do a PGC, the equivalent of a teaching qualification. I'm sure I'm forgetting really important ones now. PR as well, PR. Yeah, because I'm thinking now specific people from the previous years who have kept in touch and let us know what they're doing. But a good percentage have continued on to do PhDs as well. It is a research area that is very much sort of taking off the last 10-15 years, I suppose, and it's only going to get bigger, I think, especially as more universities hopefully in the future will be teaching fantasy and more positions will be needed, I suppose. Yeah. Will, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's very clear. It's the same as other literature master's degrees, I suppose, in the sense that our graduates end up kind of everywhere. And
transferable skills.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. So learning to write, learning to think critically is never going to be useless. So even though the degree sounds a bit niche, it's still useful for all the same things, I think, at the end of the day, employability-wise, that a general literature master's is.
Exactly. Yeah. Great. There's a question about how the MLitt intersects with, for example, the centre or other university initiatives, and also how theoretical versus practical the course is. I think these are 2 separate questions, so probably we should answer the 2 separate things really here. So again, if you watched the presentation that Will and I did, I talked quite a bit about the centre there. But the centre is an initiative that brings together different parts, not just of the English literature or even the school sort of stuff, but across colleges and across the university. So we have members, academic members of the centre who are anywhere across the college, including, for example, the School of Education and outside the College of Arts. We also have members who are from elsewhere as well. We have collaborators and partners. The centre runs a number of events every year, which will always be open to you, and sometimes you might have an opportunity to get involved with them in sort of organizing or chairing or doing, these sorts of academic sort of citizenship opportunities. The one that you will definitely have the opportunity to be involved very, very specifically is GIFCON, which is our annual fantasy conference. It's been held online for the last few years. It's built a really big international community via doing this sort of online format, and that has been very, very successful. There's a dedicated Fantasy MLitt position in the committee, so hopefully one of you will be serving in that committee next year. But there's also opportunities, as I said, to help with organizing parts of it and chairing sessions and having your first experience of possibly presenting also your research for the first time. There are also other opportunities that might have to do with centre officer positions. So very recently we advertised a social media position and or a conference administration position. These are potentially paid opportunities that, again, many of our Fantasy MLitt students applied for. There are, as I said, the events often are good opportunities because we have other academics from all over the world coming to speak to us, or creative practitioners of fantasy, not just authors, but the creatives of different sort of media of fantasy as well. Yeah, I think that's more or less it. Will this year is chairing GIFCON, so if there's, I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about GIFCON.
You can pop along if you fancy it. It's free. It's online. You've got to register in advance. They'll stick the link up again. They just did it, but I'm sure magically that one of my colleagues will make it appear a second time for you if I ask nicely enough. There we go. Yay! Thank you very much. Yeah, it will give you a good sense. Obviously, that's a conference, so the majority of the speakers are not from Glasgow, but many of them are, and everyone who's kind of involved in the organisation is a PhD student who's based in the centre. Hollie is the social media person for that, doing a lot of great work there. So it's a really good way of just seeing the kinds of conversations that are going on in the field more broadly, and of getting a sense of the kind of research that you could get involved in. Several of the speakers, I think maybe 3 or 4 of the speakers this year, Hollie, are current MLitt students, so there is an opportunity as well to see what they have been up to. So it's a really nice event. There's a little more dealing with sort of technical Zoomy things than I would love, but the payoff is that it's a truly global thing. We have people joining it from all over the world who couldn't be here otherwise, which is really exciting. So if you've got an offer or you're thinking of applying and you're sort of on the whether is this fantasy thing really, like, I like reading fantasy, but are these conversations I really want to commit myself to, then pop along to GIFCON and have a chat with us. And that's actually a really good way of getting to know who we are and what we do. Hollie, do you want to add anything about that? You've been involved with GIFCON for a while now.
Absolutely. Yep. This year's first year I've been on the committee. It's been great fun to learn exactly how things are organised and truly how international it is, like you were saying, Will. And I also get to present for the first time at GIFCON this year, which I'm very excited about.
Excellent. So the second part of that question, I don't want to lose sight of that, is how theoretical versus practical the course feels. And I think I might need a bit of clarification. I'll tell you how I understand the question, and you tell me if that is how you meant it. So in terms of the way of teaching it, I would say that it's mostly discussion based, and it's very much sort of a dialogue that is happening during seminars. There are some courses, some option courses will have lectures. There will be, especially in Fantasy 1 at the beginning, there will be bits of this 2-hour seminar session where your tutor will stop and do a short 15-minute mini lecture, as we call them sometimes, mostly to introduce big theoretical ideas and concepts in fantasy and big theorists, really. In our area, but most of it in terms of teaching is it feels very hands-on. There's a specific text to read every week, there is secondary sources to read every week, and then a lot of it is discussion, right? So you can bring the questions you have in the seminar, you can lead the discussion there and lead the way that we approach its text and lead the themes that you're interested in. So it feels practical from that. That's how I would understand practical in that context, I suppose. Does that answer the question, or would anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah. I read the question very slightly differently.
Oh, there you go. You go for it, Will.
I know, because I think your interpretation makes more sense. But I'll just guard against this idea of kind of theory in the sense of sort of high literary theory, and like how we fall out ideologically as an institution. And I think the answer to that, if that's what you mean, sort of in the sort of the slightly crude division between the more theoretical and the more history-oriented ways of teaching literature.
Cultural studies,
UK
then,
at the
yeah.
moment is a very historicist place in English literature. In that sense, it's perhaps a little bit different from places like the United States. I think, the exact journey that you'll have depends a little bit on the courses that you choose. I suspect some of them are a little bit more inclined to the theoretical than others. Our core course is quite history based in the sense that it is kind of it is a sort of more or less chronological roll through of some kind of big moments or texts in the fantasy genre. So in that sense, it's not theoretical, but at the same time, we are always inviting students to bring that stuff in. We have courses on literary theory that are around the place. I certainly teach quite a bit of it. I think we're sort of a happy medium. If that is what you meant by the question, just in case.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, Will, and I would concur with that. I would say that we're somewhere in the middle, really. There's a lot of sort of cultural history and context, but there's also a lot of theoretical concepts that will be opened. And some, as I was saying before, a lot of that will be led by you in the seminars as well, and where each particular cohort has its interests. But of course, certain courses will be more theoretically inclined, and that'll be clear in their description. So as you choose courses, that's something to look out for.
That's actually really worth emphasizing is that the core course in particular is designed to be sort of not student-led in the sense that we choose the texts and sort of ask the questions, but those are discussion sessions, and I am amazed. We've been teaching that class 3 times a week this year, and I am amazed how different each of those 3 classes is from the others, even though the text is the same. I think a real strength of the way that we teach that is that the discussion agenda is very much set by the students. So if you want to bring in your theory brain or your history brain or any other kind of brain, then usually the class is very amenable to kind of following the direction that you set. And actually at master's level, I think the responsibility of a good student is to kind of help steer things in that way. It's also, again, just possible that by practical you meant like writing fantasy. So just again to remind everybody that we do not teach. We teach reading fantasy.
Unless you take the creative writing option, which is a creative writing course, but that is an option within the whole program. The program is not a creative writing program on the whole, but yeah. Good, fine. There are options elsewhere. I teach the children's fantasy. When I teach the children's fantasy option, there is, for example, a creative writing option within that course for assessment. And I think, Will, you have a creative writing option in the world building course as well. So there are opportunities there, but the core of it is an English literature course.
Absolutely.
There's a question. Sorry, yeah, I'm just conscious of time now. I'm just thinking, gosh, are we going to answer everything? The writing sample for the application, any particular stipulations? Well, the main stipulation is what we've been sort of warning against so far, which is it has to be a critically or theoretically informed work of critical analysis rather than a creative writing piece, for example. It doesn't have to be on a work of fantasy in particular, especially if you haven't had a chance to do any fantasy in your degree or whatever else you were doing before. But we need to see that you can engage, for example, with secondary sources, that you're in control of a good referencing system, that you have a sense of how to interweave close reading, for example, with secondary research. So it's critical skills we need to see in that one. And as I said, we recognize that a lot of people come to our course exactly because they've never had a chance to study fantasy in an academic setting before. So we cannot expect a fantasy-focused essay. Or sample of an essay. Sometimes it's a bit of an essay.
We're trying to find out if you can write, put simply, and so any writing that you have that's good, and actually, yeah, if you have something that's not about fantasy that you're proud of, then something about fantasy that you've written, send us a good thing.
Yes. Show us the best of your ability, really, as a critical writer. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Question about options. Yes. So a question about options, which is whether there will be a list available of all of the courses available, oh gosh, okay. So there, I don't know how much of that came through in the presentation, but the number of choices you've got is slightly it's astronomical. It's just, you could choose potentially options from anywhere across the college. So to put a list of them is probably going to be overwhelming for most people. So what we did for the presentation is I picked the most popular ones, the ones that people have consistently chosen in the last 5-6 years or so. But there's so much else. People who have gone on to do a philosophy course, for example, or a Japanese culture course. Especially if you're interested, like in anime as fantasy, or we've had I'm just trying to think what other strange one we've had before. Definitely history courses have been picked as well. So the list is way too long in some ways, and it can be quite overwhelming. So it's worth thinking about. It's worth having a look at the ones we've suggested. As I said, these have been quite conducive for people to think through, for example, what they might want to do for the dissertation, or the ones that we've handpicked to fit more generally around fantasy. But the General University website does have a very, very unwieldy, I think, long list of courses per school. So you could go to the School of Critical Studies and see all the options there, and then go to the School of TV and Drama TV. God, I'm losing my the title. Or School of Humanities, for example, or the School of Contemporary, so comparative literature, and see all of their lists of courses. But that might be counterproductive. That's what I'm saying. Maybe it's worth thinking what you'd like to do, and then look at that particular area, rather than providing a comprehensive list, which is probably going to be a little bit mad.
It's also worth saying, if you happen to through your searches find our big course catalogue, which is generally available, not everything on it runs every year. So
yes.
If there's a particular course that you've got your heart set on, do drop us a line before you kind of come here specifically to do this one thing. The other thing to say is that optional courses need to recruit a certain number of students per year to run. So there is always the possibility that if you're passionate about a specific course, but turn out to be the only person who is, that you might get asked to choose again. So not everything on there is guaranteed. But if you have questions about an individual course, let us know. And the question, actually, Dimitra said something about reading lists as well. So the answer on reading lists is that is going to be different course to course. A course that's brand new might not have everything yet. It's courses that are being significantly rewritten over the summer. So for the person who asked that question, if you want to drop us a line with the names of the courses you're particularly interested in, we can put you in touch with the people who have the lists for those courses, if they exist yet. And even if they don't exist, that person can probably give you at least a sense of what the big texts are going to be.
Yeah, sure. For the core courses, you will get a reading list early in the summer. So you at least, these are the two, Fantasy 1 and Fantasy 2, you're going to have to do. They are part of your core courses. So with those, you will have plenty of opportunity to get started with the reading beforehand. Hollie, is it worth, since we're talking about options, is it worth asking you? Do you remember what options you took back in the day?
I cast my mind back. Along with the core courses, I remember taking the Fantasy Across Media course, which was amazing.
Which is still running.
Brilliant for if you're interested in how. Still going. It's still going. Yeah, really good for if you're interested in analysing fantasy sort of outside of like the written text. Look at musicals, films, TV shows, video games. It's a brilliant course. I also took a couple of like non-fantasy courses, medical humanities, which was very interesting. Still ended up writing on the fantasy for that one, though, as I distinctly remember. Drawing a blank on the other ones. I think I did another one that was specifically science fiction, 1945 to present day. So there's a really wide variety. It gets quite, there's some that are quite specific, like the science fiction one. there are others that are a little more broad. So there's something for everyone.
Great. There was oh, right. So the person who asked about the theoretical versus practical has come back with an explanation, which is none of the two we had to go at with. Not how I understood the question, not how you understood the question. So by practical, they meant more about how the course extends beyond discussion of academic theory into applicability or outreach in the wider world. It's a really good question, and that's something that, especially if you're thinking of going into your PhD, is something that is worth start thinking about, because PhD funders want you to start thinking about that as well. So
Absolutely.
you will be talking about public engagement, knowledge exchange, and impact, and how, you know, what you're doing as academic research has an impact in the outside world. First of all, as part of your research training course, and that is the course that sets you up, you know, with all of the research skills you need. So this idea that the academia should not be sort of in its ivory tower and not talking to society. That's something that's very much part of our ethos in Glasgow, and I would say all over the UK at the moment. So there will be examples that will be discussed there. We usually also bring people who, again, came through the route that you did, and we'll talk about how they navigated that. But also, I suppose this is also part of the centre's commitment and the centre's sort of values and aims, which is thinking about how, for example, fantasy might have social implications. How can it help us imagining things differently, imagining society differently potentially, and how all of these things actually can seep out of academia into the wider world. Fantasy in particular is an area of academic research that is very much benefiting from this, from the cross-pollination between academics and fandom and creatives. So in the centre, we bring these things together very often, and hopefully, you know, there's been so many examples where we've seen this working really, really well. So, for example, a couple of years ago, we had a funded UK sort of government funded project at the centre, which was Future Voices of Scottish Science Fiction and Fantasy, which particularly privileged both established and new voices in Scottish practitioners of science fiction and fantasy, and that privileged particularly people who were from disadvantaged categories in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of disability, and that, you know, had implications for those people and for the people that discovered their work, for example. And all that was also theorized and discussed and written about by early career academics who have come through the centre too. So a lot of these, you know, there is a lot of joint up thinking going on there. As master students, there's no expectation that you'll do that. But as I said, if you are, especially if you're thinking about going on to do a PhD, it is worth starting thinking about it. And that's why we discuss these things as part of the research training course, and also the opportunities you get through attending things at the centre. Hopefully that answers that.
I'll just give another couple of examples. We're talking about WorldCon, Dimitra, because
yes.
One thing that's happening this summer is that WorldCon is coming to Glasgow. If you've gone so far as to express an interest in this program, you're probably someone who's heard of WorldCon. But just in case you haven't, it's the kind of big annual science fiction fantasy convention. It moves all around the world. It was in China last year. It's coming to Glasgow. Two of the centre's members are running the academic track in that conference, convention. But there are also going to be fringe events that we, the centre, are going to run that aren't kind of directly affiliated with WorldCon, but will happen at the same time. And those events are
will be open to WorldCon attendees. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So again, that's part of our interface with the public. But we're always doing little things. Another example is that I'm running a series of creative writing workshops at the Hunterian Museum, which is an amazing museum on campus here for secondary school age, or high school if you're American age kids, thinking about the ways in which museums make us imagine things. You know, it's a standard part of what we do every day. I would say it's quite unusual for master's students to be directly involved in kind of public outreachy stuff, but not unprecedented. And also, if you've got an idea, once you're on the course, we'll probably listen to you. So that's worth saying as well. There was a good question I saw. Oh no, I've lost it now. Oh yes, what place is there for students to discuss their own favourite fantasy works in the courses, and not just through the dissertation? So it's basically everywhere, I think I would say. The core course is astonishingly flexible in terms of what you can write about. So although, again, there's weekly text and set readings, the assessments you can write on anything as long as it's published before 1950 in the case of Core 1 and after 1950 in the case of Core 2, and as long as it's arguably a work of fantasy in the broadest sense. You can write those assignments on anything you like, and people really do. I've had to read quite a few things that I hadn't heard of as a result of students bringing their interests into these things, and it's great. Even the discussions are like that. You know, there are with this year's cohort, there are certain texts that I know I'm going to hear about every week, regardless of what the subject is, and that's part of the pleasure of teaching it. People bring their own stuff, and that's absolutely fine, and indeed encouraged.
Exactly.
Do you want to add anything to that?
No, that's exactly what I was thinking. It's that despite the fact that there are set texts, obviously in every week in the core courses, there is freedom to write on other texts that we didn't discuss in class. Especially, if you've been thinking about the concepts or ideas or sort of historical context that we've been discussing, and you want to apply that elsewhere. And the same is, I would say the same is the case in most option courses as well, at least the ones that, we presented as the more popular ones in the presentation. They also have this open policy of formulating. That's another thing that sometimes people find strange. It's formulating your own essay questions, and often based on the text you want to talk about rather than the set texts within the course. Hopefully that answered the question, but do ask further if you want any more details on that. Okay. That's a good question.
Yeah, this is a good. Are you looking at the science fiction one, Dimitra?
Yes. Do you want to go for that, Will?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's fair to say every member of the Centre for Teaching Staff conceptualizes this difference slightly differently. But our broad policy is to be as Catholic with a small c as possible about what fantasy is, to use the widest definition that we can without it becoming useless. And in that wide definition, the fantastic rather than fantasy, perhaps. That certainly includes science fiction. I've marked quite a lot of work about the science fiction this year. My own background as a scholar is in science fiction studies before I started writing more about fantasy more recently. I don't, I think my answer to that as an academic is that that distinction is so muddy that it's not useful to spend a lot of time trying to pin down, exactly where, on what day of the week H.G. Wells wakes up and decides to write fantasy as opposed to deciding to write science fiction. He didn't think of either of those words in the sense that we now understand them, and it's not always useful for us to try and police that. So there are science fiction dedicated master's degrees elsewhere in the country. For example, I think at Liverpool at the moment has a good one. There's some in London. If you are if you're a dyed to the wool science fiction person, you might want to check out those programs. You're probably looking at them already. That said, we have sci-fi people who are very definitely sci-fi people on the fantasy course. They're having a great time, as far as I can tell. I really value the perspectives they have in the room. We teach several texts, especially on Fantasy 2, that are arguably more science fiction-y than fantasy. Texts like Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation is on the syllabus this year, which I think is a wonderful sci-fi text that is also wonderful when read through the lens of fantasy and thinking about it from that angle. So yeah, fantasy in the broadest sense definitely includes science fiction as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. You may feel slightly differently about it as a scholar, and that's completely fine with me. I think it's just something to keep talking about and thinking about.
Sure. I mean, that's part of our I suppose, we don't have a manifesto quite as a centre, although we've talked about that. But, we tend to think about these terms in a broader and more inclusive sense, I suppose. And the definition that a lot of us sort of like to repeat is fantasy is the literature of the impossible, in which case science fiction can very happily, implausible, I suppose, science fiction can very happily fit under that. under that as well. And there is a long tradition of teaching fantasy and science fiction together. Great. Okay.
There was a question came up a while ago about what the motto of the Fantasy MLitt would be if we had one, and that's a nasty one to put us on the spot with. But the motto of Terry Pratchett's Unseen University is "Nunc invides, nunc ne vides," which is Latin for "Now you see it, now you don't." I'd be happy with that one. I don't know if either of you have any better ideas. I feel like if you gave me another sort of 48 hours, I could come up with a better answer to that.
Sure. No, we don't have a motto as such, but it might be worth, again, looking through the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic, the About page, especially where we're talking about the aims of the centre. And in many ways, that is what's driving us. These are the things that we're aiming to do as researchers, but also as you know, as readers ourselves, and as fans, as often as people involved in the creative side of things as well. You'd probably, I don't know how many of you have looked us up, but Will has recently had a children's fantasy. I suppose you'd class it under that, right? Do you want to talk quickly to us about your Choose Your Own Adventure?
Oh,
Will?
gosh.
I put you on the spot there, sorry.
Yeah. Yes, so something I'm interested in is kind of interactive fiction and games. And actually, we haven't said this yet, but we've got quite a few people in the centre who are interested in kind of tabletop games, video games. And there is at Glasgow a centre separate to the Fantasy Centre, but lots of links to it, a centre for games and gaming. And we do things with them sometimes. So we've got students writing dissertations and PhD theses as well about D&D and other things like that. And my particular little corner of that is Choose Your Own Adventure. So adventure game books, things like the fighting fantasy books where you roll dice and make decisions and turn to page 355 if you want to turn left and page 89 if you want to turn right and stuff like that. So yeah, so I have co-written one of those with Usborne for my sins. It's not my main qualification, I would say, but it was a lot of fun. And I'm very happy to talk to anyone who wants to talk about interactive fiction. I think that's a frontier in the field more widely. It's certainly something that I'm hoping to do more with. Yeah.
Sounds good. Okay.
We're beginning to wrap up now, I think. If you have any final questions, pop them in. It's sort of now or never moment, I think, although
definitely.
Of course, we're very open to emails. If you think of something after the fact, or if you're watching this as a recording later, do drop us a line. I think we were asked, Dimitra and Hollie, to wind up by starting to think a little bit about the best aspects of the centre and of the programme as far as we're concerned. Dimitra, do you fancy being put on the spot with that one?
The best aspects, oh gosh, that is a hard one. The best aspects of the centre of the program. For me, the best aspect of the program in particular, is that I get to learn lots of things from my students every year, especially new texts that I don't know about, especially sort of new subgenres that seem to be, cropping up, including new theoretical ideas as well. So this interaction in class for me is the highlight. There's nothing like it. There's nothing like the sort of cross-pollination of ideas that happens in the classroom. However much at times, I'm thinking, I would just want to lock myself in and finish my book. I don't think I could be a researcher without teaching. So this is the best thing. People coming to this course are very invested in what they're doing, and it's a great atmosphere and a great place to teach, a great place from which to teach. In terms of the centre, for me, one of the best things is all the partnerships and people we work with, especially as creative practitioners, people from other organisations and universities. Like, for example, a couple of years ago, we had a huge international conference called Once and Future Fantasies with the International Association of the Fantastic in the Arts, which is a USA-based organisation. And that was the first time this conference happened outside of North America. So these sorts of big international collaborations where people come together to share their ideas is a big highlight for me. Who's next?
Hollie,
does anybody want to answer? Hollie, do you want to have a go?
Very well. For me, one of the great sort of like advantages to both the program and the center is like the celebration of niche enthusiasm, where, you know, I had students, fellow students come in who were just had such passion and dedication for like very specific subjects. One fellow student of mine dedicated to the Cthulhu mythos, and ended up writing his entire dissertation on it. And just the power of enthusiasm is just fully embraced and celebrated. There's that sense of like, no, you must have a perfect broad application of all of the canonical texts. There's an element of that, but it's an avenue into these texts which you never may have heard of before. And you know, if you want to write an entire essay on Beetlejuice the musical like I did, you can. It's fully celebrated. But yeah, for me, that was one of the best bits.
Thank you, Hollie.
Yeah, and yes, and I guess I feel all of those things as well. I think the thing I would add to that, I already said something I was surprised by when I first came here. I'm relatively new, by the way. I've worked here for about a year and a half. And one of the big surprises to me, I've already mentioned, was how international the course was, but also what a strength that is. I don't think it's necessarily a strength for a very international course, but I think with a subject like this, it works brilliantly because everyone is bringing a slightly different idea of what fantasy is from their education and from their cultural context, and sometimes that generates surprising and really exciting conversations. The other thing is, I think the program's uniqueness means that everyone we get has, as Hollie says, that kind of niche passion, and it means that there is never, you know, there's almost never a quiet moment in those classrooms. Everyone is there because they really want to talk about this stuff, and the excitement that all the students have, I think, really sets it apart from a lot of the other master's programs I've taught on in my career. I think it is unique and special, and I think our students get a sense of that when they arrive, and that they rise to it in a way. So I think it's the appeal, like Hollie says, of finding a small group of very precisely like-minded people, but who have come from kind of a very wide range of different backgrounds. It's phenomenally exciting to teach. Certainly, I was not around when I was at this stage, and I am. You know, that's one thing I'm really sad about. I never got to take this course. I would have loved it.
Sure. Okay, so we are going to leave it at that, I think. And as Will said, do feel free to drop us a line if something suddenly occurs to you after the event, or if you're watching this as a recorded program. So we look forward to welcoming you at Glasgow. If you have had your offer, you will have, as I was saying before, you will receive a reading list in the next early in the summer, so you can start preparing. And yeah, it'll be great to welcome you to a lovely campus with all of its gothicness and unicorns and all sorts of, you know, lovely bits and pieces. So that's goodbye from all of us.
They're not real unicorns. Just don't overpromise it, Dimitra. They are just
true. Yes. We're talking about proper sort of, you know, gargoyle sort of things really here. But yeah, unicorns are a particular Scottish thing. So you will see them quite a lot depicted around campus. Definitely. Okay. So goodbye, everyone. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Take care of yourselves.